Okay, so a number of weeks ago, I read a very interesting article written by Dr. Dale Tuggy. He's a Unitarian Christian, and he wrote Jesus as an exemplar of faith in the New Testament. And if you want to read it, the original document is on Academia. You can download the PDF. It is extremely heavy reading, 8,385 words to be precise. And it was quite a work to get through it. Anyway, I recently became acquainted with a new IT tool called ChatGPT, and I got it to summarize it. And it is now, I can now understand it, and it is far more easy to understand than the original, but it's worth comparing reading the original because it's amazing the words that people can use and how they explain things. It's a different way ordinary people do it. So this is the article. This is a summary, which is going to take some time. So Jesus as an exemplar of faith in the New Testament. Introduction and thesis. The central thesis of this talk is that the New Testament clearly portrays Jesus as a person who trusted God, and that this fact has profound implications for Christian theology. Specifically, if Jesus had and exercised faith in God, then Jesus cannot be fully divine in the traditional metaphysical sense used by most proponents of classical Trinitarianism. A fully divine, omniscient being cannot properly be said to have faith in God, because faith involves trust in what is unknown, uncertain, or at least not directly known. Yet the New Testament repeatedly describes Jesus' relationship toward God in terms that match the biblical and theological concept of faith. Therefore, the New Testament vision of Jesus as a faithful human being stands in tension with mainstream Orthodox Christology. This talk begins by stressing that many Christian theologians, particularly in the post-classical Latin tradition, have denied or downplayed the idea that Jesus had faith. The reason is not merely incidental. If Jesus is God himself, fully divine and omniscient, then it seems incoherent to attribute to him an attitude of trusting devotion toward God. Trust implies a lack of direct knowledge, a need to rely on another. A divine being does not need to rely on anyone and does not trust in anyone. Thus, traditional theologians often claim that while Jesus appeared to have faith, he did not truly need to or exercise it. This essay begins by formulating the core logical tension in deductive form. Point 1, Jesus had faith in God. Point 2, a fully divine being never has faith in God. Point 3, therefore Jesus was not fully divine. Every major branch of Christian theology accepts premise 2, that is, a fully divine being never has faith in God, at least implicitly, because classical theology defines divinity in terms that exclude the possibility of exercising faith. Therefore, the main thrust of this talk is directed toward defending premise 1, which is Jesus did have faith according to the New Testament authors. The New Testament texts, when read without theological filters, repeatedly describe Jesus as one who trusted, relied upon, and submitted to God. Precisely the qualities that constitute biblical faith. If the New Testament witnesses Jesus as a model of faith, then Christians must either revise their doctrine of Jesus and divinity or reinterpret the meaning of these biblical passages, which many theologians have tried to do. The simplest reading of the New Testament is that Jesus was a truly faithful human being who depended upon God. He did not have absolute divine certainty, nor did he possess omniscience, but instead lived with full trust in the God he called Father. Historical background. Why some theologians denied Jesus had faith. Many traditional Christian thinkers rejected the idea that Jesus had faith. The most prominent example is Thomas Aquinas. According to Aquinas, Jesus could not have had faith because faith requires belief without direct knowledge, but Jesus, Aquinas argues, possessed the beatific vision from conception onward, meaning he directly beheld God and therefore he had no need of faith. For Aquinas and similar theologians, saying Jesus had faith would imply an imperfection incompatible with his full divinity. Aquinas is not unique in this claim. Many theologians have assumed it implicitly, because Jesus is supposed to be omniscient, all-knowing and incapable of error. It would be incoherent to say he trusted God in the same sense humans do. Instead, theologians sometimes reinterpret the New Testament statements about Jesus' trust, prayer, and obedience as merely pedagogical or exemplary acts, not expressions of genuine personal reliance. So when Jesus prayed, he wasn't really praying, but merely demonstrating what we should do if we were in a similar situation. This theological resistance is not random, but rests on deep doctrinal commitments about divine perfection. Christian orthodoxy, especially post-Nicene, defines God as unchanging, omniscient, maximally perfect, possessing total self-knowledge, and not subject to risk, ignorance, or dependency. If Jesus possesses this same divine nature, then he could not meaningfully trust God. His tendency shows theological systems can drive. Bear with me. Okay. This tendency shows how theological systems can drive interpretation. Many Christians read the New Testament believing in the full deity of Christ, and it cannot conceive of Jesus lacking full divine knowledge. Because of this assumption, they conclude that passages showing Jesus praying, pleading, or expressing trust must be read metaphorically or must refer only to his human nature, in inverted commas. The paper argues that this approach reverses proper reasoning. Instead of allowing Scripture to define theological conclusions, it forces Scripture into pre-existing metaphysical categories. 3. The meaning of faith in biblical and theological context. In the New Testament, faith, the Greek word pistis, is not merely belief that something is true, but a three-part function. These three functions are, 1, cognitive assent, belief that something is true. 2, affective trust, personal reliance on God. 3, behavioral commitment, obedient conduct consistent with that trust. In biblical context, faith is inherently relational, directed toward God, and involves risk, vulnerability, and dependence. It is the acceptance of what is unseen or uncertain, Hebrews 11:1. Faith includes the possibility of doubt, struggle, and testing. For this reason, it is impossible to ascribe faith to a being who is omnisciently aware of every fact and outcome. Christian faith is not mere intellectual belief, but a mode of loyal trust under uncertainty. If a person is metaphysically incapable of ignorance, temptation, or risk, then they cannot meaningfully engage in faith. The author underscores that even the idea of perfect faith does not bypass this, because biblical faith is necessarily non-omniscient faith. Thus, if the New Testament portrays Jesus as genuinely trusting God under uncertainty, facing real temptation, danger, and unanswered questions, then he did not have the cognitive state traditionally attributed to a fully divine being. Point 4. Philosophical argument that a fully divine being cannot have faith. Having established what faith is, it follows that a fully divine being, in a classical sense, cannot have faith. If God is omniscient, perfectly good, sovereign, and self-sufficient, then God does not face uncertainty. God cannot be tempted to distrust himself, because God is necessarily perfect. Therefore, if Jesus is fully divine, he cannot have faith. Even theological systems that see God as lacking exhaustive foreknowledge, such as open theism, still present God as necessarily righteous and fully aware of his own goodness. God may not know every future contingency, but he still knows that his will and goodness. God may not know every future contingency, but he still knows that his will and plan will succeed. Therefore, even under open theism, God cannot meaningfully experience faith, because faith is not merely uncertainty about outcomes, it is trust in another being. Faith is other-directed. That is, it is directed toward another individual. It is trust in someone higher, but God has no one higher to trust. God is the ultimate object of faith, not a participant in faith. A divine person cannot exercise faith in someone else because that implies subordination, conscious dependence, and vulnerability. If Jesus had and exercised faith, then Jesus was not identical in nature to God in the traditional metaphysical sense. He was not the ultimate self-grounding, omniscient being who has no need to trust. Point 5. Five lines of New Testament evidence that Jesus had faith. This section forms the heart of the argument. There are 5 overlapping categories of New Testament evidence showing that Jesus exercised faith in God. Direct statements about Jesus' faith. Point 1. The clearest evidence comes from Hebrews. The author of Hebrews explicitly identifies Jesus as a model of faith and uses language normally applied to human believers. Hebrews 12:2. Jesus is the pioneer and perfecter of faith, many translations, author and finisher. This phrase most naturally means that Jesus had and completed a life of faithful trust. Hebrews 2:13. Jesus speaks in the first person, saying, I will put my trust in him, citing Isaiah. The author applies this to Jesus' earthly life. Hebrews 3:2 and 3:5 compare Jesus to Moses as one who was faithful to God. The book of Hebrews alone is sufficient to establish that Jesus had faith. The author of Hebrews does not describe Jesus pretending to trust or merely teaching about faith. He portrays Jesus as living it. More broadly, New Testament writers constantly associate Jesus' obedience, prayer-like, and a reliance on God with exemplary faith. The cumulative impression is of a man who trusted God in all things. Number 2, Jesus' prayer and last words. The Gospels portray Jesus as one who prays regularly, intensely, and with deep reliance. Prayer is a primary expression of faith. Someone who knows all things does not need to ask questions, seek guidance, or express distress before God. Jesus' life culminates in 2 major expressions of faithful trust. First one, Gethsemane. Jesus prays in distress, asking for deliverance, submitting his will to God's. This is not a staged performance, but genuine human vulnerability. Prayer to God's. The crucifixion sayings. Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Luke 23, verse 46, is an explicit statement of trust. Another saying, my God, why have you forsaken me? Mark 15:34, displays the relational struggle that accompanies true faith under suffering. These stories cannot be reconciled with absolute divine omniscience and self-possession. Jesus feels forsaken. He commits himself to God. These are not the acts of one who already possesses divine certainty. Point 3, enemy testimony. Even Jesus' enemies described him as trusting God. At the crucifixion, the mockers say, he trusts in God. Let God deliver him if he delights in him. Matthew 27:43. This is intended as ridicule, yet it reveals what Jesus was publicly known for, trusting God. The Gospel writers use this taunt as ironic evidence of Jesus' faith. If the mocking is accurate, Jesus' faith was visible and distinctive. If the accusation was false, the gospel authors would have corrected it, but they do not. This point reinforces that Jesus' faith was not secret or merely internal. It was widely recognized and mocked. Point 4, Jesus' temptations. A major line of argument comes from the New Testament portrayal of Jesus being tempted in all ways as humans are, Hebrews 4:15. Temptation is the biblical sense, in the biblical sense, is often temptation to distrust God, to abandon faith. Faith cannot be tempted unless it is real. Tuggy emphasizes that the very concept of temptation requires possibility. If it was impossible for Jesus to doubt, turn away, or disobey, then his temptations were hollow. They were mere appearances of struggle, not genuine tests. The gospel accounts attach real emotional stress to Jesus' temptations. Whether in the desert with Satan or facing the cross, he is described as genuinely wrestling with trust and obedience. But being incapable of error or ignorance cannot meaningfully be tempted. Hence, classical Christology struggles to make sense of passages that describe Jesus' psychological experience. Point 5, the narrative portrayal of Jesus' ministry. The whole shape of Jesus' life, traveling, preaching, provoking opposition, risking death, presupposes conviction and trust, not divine certainty. Jesus behaves as one who believes he has been sent by God, but not as one who knows everything with omniscient assurance. He exercises discernment, seeks guidance, and speaks of not knowing certain things, e.g. the hour of the end, Mark 13:32. His entire ministry can be seen as a prolonged act of faith that God will vindicate him. The most natural reading of the gospel narratives is that Jesus truly trusted God, not that he possessed divine certainty and simply acted as a model for others. Point 6, theological attempts to avoid Jesus' faith. Once premise 1 is established, Tuggy turns briefly to premise 2. Almost all traditional Christian theologians accept that God cannot have faith. Thus, if Jesus had faith, they must deny or redefine it. Classical two natures theology insists that Jesus was fully divine and fully human. To preserve this concept, theologians must say Jesus' faith belongs only to his human nature. This solution fails because, firstly, natures do not have faith, do not have belief. Persons do. Faith is a mental state of a subject, not of an abstract nature. Point 2, splitting Jesus' psychology produces two subjects. If his divine mind remained omniscient while his human mind believed and hoped, then there are effectively two centers of consciousness in Jesus. Point 3, Jesus' own statements become misleading. When Jesus says he does not know something, would he be speaking sincerely? If his divine nature knows everything, then Jesus' statements of ignorance are deceptive. Theologians sometimes respond that Jesus chose not to access divine knowledge, but if he could access it at any moment, then his ignorance was voluntary illusion, not genuine unknowing. That is not faith. Another alternative is kenotic Christology, which states that Jesus relinquished divine attributes to become human. That is, he emptied himself of divine glory. This avoids some problems, but also contradicts classical orthodoxy, since it portrays Jesus as ceasing to be fully divine during his earthly life. In every case, attempts to affirm that Jesus was fully divine while maintaining biblical depictions of faith result in complex metaphysical constructions that stretch coherence. The most straightforward explanation is that Jesus was a fully human Messiah who relied on God. Why Jesus as a man of faith is theologically important. The New Testament authors frequently present Jesus as a model of faith. Believers are told to imitate his faith. He becomes the exemplar, not because he is omniscient, but because he trusted God unto death. This theme is especially strong in Hebrews chapters 11 and chapters 12, where Jesus crowns a list of faithful saints. The author presents Jesus as part of the lineage of those who trusted God in weakness and suffering. If Jesus is instead of an omniscient divine person pretending to trust God, then this model collapses. The rhetoric of many New Testament passages depends on Jesus being one of us, someone who believed before seeing. This theological point is weakened if Jesus is considered incapable of doubt or ignorance. Faith demands uncertainty and demands risk. Jesus possessed none, then his life was not a life of faith. If Jesus possessed none, then his life was not a life of faith. Jesus' faith and the logic of Christology. This essay concludes by tracking the structural consequences of accepting that Jesus had faith. If Jesus had faith, he lacked full divine certainty. If he lacked full divine certainty, he did not possess omniscience during his earthly life. If he did not possess omniscience, he did not have the set of divine attributes traditionally considered essential to deity. Therefore, unless one rejects the standard understanding of faith or the classic attributes of God, one must either deny that Jesus was fully divine, in the classical sense, Unitarian Father-only divinity, or radically revise the doctrine of God to allow God to exercise trust and experience ignorance, a move that is inconsistent with most Christian theological traditions. The New Testament depicts Jesus as God's Messiah, uniquely empowered and exalted, but not as a divine being who himself is God. After his resurrection, God exalts Jesus, grants him authority, and seats him at his right hand, indicating that divine power is bestowed, not intrinsic. Thus, Christian theology should regard Jesus as a perfect man of faith, not as divine in the metaphysical sense later developed in creeds. Conclusion. The conclusion is simple but forceful. The New Testament presents Jesus as the supreme human model of faith in God. This includes personal trust, obedience under uncertainty, prayerful dependence, and perseverance unto death. The texts do not imply that Jesus' faith was only apparent or pedagogical, but rather he truly exercised trust in his Father. But a fully divine being cannot experience faith. Faith logically requires lack of perfect knowledge and reliance on someone greater. Therefore, one cannot consistently affirm both that Jesus had faith and that he was fully divine in the classical metaphysical sense. Christians must choose between revising their Christology or reinterpreting the many passages describing Jesus' faith. Tuggy argues that the simplest, most textually faithful reading is that Jesus was not fully divine, but was instead the unique, spirit-anointed Messiah whom God raised and exalted, the first and greatest of the faithful.